Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second form in our learning series. Can you go to the next slide, please? As we transition from the strict plan development phase of our learning, we wanted to ground you with our overall intention for this year's series. I won't read through all of these, but essentially we are designing each form to learn from folks with subject matter expertise, learn from one another, build capacity, and anchor our work in community, prevention, and equitable outcomes. The subheader to all of these goals is the intention to grow and extend your leadership capacity to effectively engage with communities that are marginalized, underestimated, and where hope is suppressed. A zip code should not determine a child or family's wellness or health. Our work is to help communities thrive. The last form focused on tools and approaches towards race equity and inclusion, and how to measure and decrease disproportionality. This learning form today is focused on anchoring our service delivery system in primary prevention. Before I introduce our guests, this work can't happen without addressing centuries of collective harm and trauma to African American and tribal children and families. We must make an intentional choice to rebuild communities in an equitable manner. Each of the learning forms will start with this acknowledgement of our collective history as a step towards reconciliation and a constant reminder of our intentions, purpose, and goals for why we are coming together. I acknowledge that I'm sitting on the traditional territory of the Coahuila people, who are the rightful owners of the land we now call the Coachella Valley. I also want to acknowledge and pay respect to our African ancestors for the enslaved forced labor they had to endure for this country's development and economic progress. I highly encourage everyone to do their own research on these aspects of our history. Next slide. So today's meeting will be led by our two experts, John Pedigo and Junius Williams. John is the Director of Advocacy and Community Engagement for Catholic Charities in Santa Clara County. And Mr. Williams is the principal of Junius Williams Consulting, a firm specializing in collaboration design, facilitation, and program and strategy developed focus on increasing equitable and social justice. And our moderator, as usual, is Kush Cooper, an adjunct professor at UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs, as well as the CEO of Implematics. Kush, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dana. Good morning, everyone. Before I get going, want to acknowledge living and working on the traditional ancestral and unceded territory of the Chumash Gabrielino, Tongva, Fernandino Tatavian, and the Fernandino Tatavian peoples, who are the rightful owners of the land we now call the San Fernando Valley. All right, so I want to just take a few minutes and set some context for today, and then without much ado, turn it over to our esteemed presenters. Our discussions of family violence, domestic violence, child maltreatment typically begin downstream, when families are already involved with or at the brink of systems involvement. And when I say our discussions, I mean the discussions in county systems. So we start downstream, and as this picture shows, right, downstream, where folks have already fallen in the water, right? And then we try and move upstream so we can get a better view of what might have people be falling into the water in the first place, okay? The root causes of family violence, and you'll hear about this from our presenters. and the associated systems involvement that results, those root causes lie upstream. And most of those root causes are the result of structural inequities and economic disadvantage. The bridges are broken upstream. There are no handrails on really precarious ground. Folks are going to fall into the water. There's reduced access to social determinants of health and protective factors. There's increased exposure to community risk factors. Okay? So if we flip this script, is what I'm inviting you to do, is actually stand upstream. Let's stand upstream today. Begin the discussion there, is that's where primary prevention and restoring structural equity lives. That's when we're going to get the biggest return on our investment. And ultimately, that's the right thing to do for communities and families that have been marginalized for a long time. So over the next two presentations, I'll hope you'll start to see, okay, so if we're standing there and we need to start planning on our primary prevention part of our system, what's this going to require? Well, it's going to require co-design with those communities overrepresented in child welfare systems. And this co-design is going to have to integrate, regardless of your target population, integrate a respect for tribal sovereignty and racial equity and inclusion. It's going to take identifying community leaders, natural supports, and local assets. Those are terms, child welfare and probation for sure, haven't used often in the past. So it's going to take some education around how you do that. And hopefully this learning series will begin that education. It's going to take authentic as opposed to tokenistic community engagement. You're going to hear about moving beyond outreach, which means where somebody's on the outs and you got to go reach them, right? We're going to move from outreach to authentic engagement. We're going to talk about how you support mutual aid systems in communities where communities are relying on each other rather than systems, and have gotten to a point of health where that's possible. You're going to hear about making partnerships rather than throwing grants at a community, right? And what else is this going to require? It's going to require incorporating tribal sovereignty, racial equity, and inclusion into all aspects going forward for primary prevention planning. How the governance of our primary prevention systems, the partnerships that we're going to create, and the humility inside of which we're going to create them, and the service provision and the service strategies we're going to choose, right? So that's what I hope you take away after our session today. Now I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, John Pedigo. John, welcome. Thanks for joining us, and please go ahead.
Thanks for the introduction. My name is John Pedigo. I'm about less than a mile away from the Parastic village that belonged to that was part of the Aramai people of the Ohlone-speaking community in the Bay Area. So I would like to just see if we can't just do a poll as I talk over this next slide. To do that, I think we have a poll that we might be able to do at this moment. So let's see how that goes in. All right, so while we're doing that, I just want to kind of give a context of what I want to do for us today. I'm going to be speaking from inside a community-based organization. I've been working in community organizing for a number of years, working with faith communities, working in labor, and then working in neighborhoods. My present gig right now is to work within with a very large institutional agency with now kind of an innovative division, which is what we're doing is community engagement, and it's called advocacy and community engagement. I want to talk about anchoring ourselves in a conversation around how do we kind of move beyond as I think Kush was saying, from just outreach to real engagement. And then we're going to talk about partnerships in my work today. So I really want to kind of get into that piece. Let's go to the next slide, if we could do that. And great. All right. And the big thing I want to talk about today also is this question of culture and how do we engage people where they're at, and while keeping in mind that this is a very specific case study that I'm working with. So let's go to the next slide, if we could do that. We've heard that expression, culture eats strategy for breakfast. It's a quick takeaway. I just find that really kind of interesting, that what if we were to substitute the word culture, but we talk about lived experience eats strategy for breakfast, or we talk about trauma experience eats strategy for breakfast. And we look at the word strategy. Could be our policies, could be the way that we set up a contract, it could be the way that we have set up our expectations and deliverables with a partner that's in a community organization, that's in a community-based organization. What would that look like if we were to do that? So that's a part that I'm really kind of concerned about. So let's go to the next slide, if we could do that. What we're doing, and I'm just going to give you two brief examples and just see how they're kind of woven in through my presentation. The first is a Spanish expression that we use in La Cultura Cura, which means that culture is a healing element of what we're doing. Culture, the music, the food, the language, the way that people talk to each other, resolve conflicts, the way that they interact with each other, that really is part of the fabric of a community. So when we're not engaging in the life experience of the people, and if we set up systems that don't really connect with the people's experience, what happens is that we have a real problem, because we're disconnected. And so if the people find certain things very important to them, and yet we're not even addressing those issues, it's very difficult to bring them on board, and we're always going to be seen as an outsider. So the question is breaking into and working with communities, as communities becoming self-directed, expressing their self-agency. We use a system called promotoras, which is really well known in public health. We're using it in immigration work, immigrant rights work, rental rights work, but we're also using those more frequently with probation, and perhaps even with this particular with folks that are doing working in foster care. The promotoras are people who have lived experience, live in a geographical area, and they reach out to their own community members, and they have immediate kind of power of influence. So they're kind of like influencers, although many of them are not, aren't really trained in TikTok and all those other kinds of social media, but they have the influence of knocking on somebody's door and having a conversation. And so we find that the connection, the integrated community web of relationships and trust, working with promotoras and developing promotoras, engaging promotoras in the deciding process, in even formation of budgets, even in the process of creating strategies for community engagement. That's really kind of key. So let's go to the next slide. So I just want to kind of keep those things as we move forward. So here's some of the principles that we've been using in a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging strategy. So it's that belonging piece that we really think is very important. So we're going to kind of hold on to that moment for a second. Looking at your polls, most of you have, in fact, worked with CBOs and place-based CBO, which is really great. And then there's really kind of interesting of entering into actual partnerships, how they show data. And that's really great, because we're actually inviting people in the community who are able to have a conversation with us as co-equal partners around strategies and action plans. So here's kind of where I just wanted to talk about the idea of capacity building, or in Spanish, capacitación. That's really important, that we're building we're building up the ability and skills within the community for them to solve their own challenges. So when you go upstream, it's really building up the capacity in the village, in that community, to make those decisions about, do they want to go upstream? What do they need to take upstream with them to address some of these issues? So the community is really driving that agenda. They're making that decision to move forward. Self-agency and self-determination are really key elements of community life. When people don't feel that they have that decision-making power, when they feel that they're disengaged from the community, when they feel that they're really disengaged from the work, it's very, very difficult to move them forward, in terms of kind of creating those assets and putting those assets to work for themselves. So we create, how do we need to build those assets? That's where community organizing, that blend of deep listening and holding on to what the people are saying, and creating structures to capture those priorities, to capture that input. That's absolutely key and important for us in moving forward. So that's one of the principles. The other principle we have is a community holds the power of healing. This is really, really important for us. In the communities that we're working with, mostly undocumented communities, marginalized politically, economically, socially, there are many and multiple levels of trauma that are going on. Culture is one way to help kind of soothe the soothing balm that brings a sense of confidence, a sense of connectivity with other people in the community, so that when a promotora approaches a neighbors, there is an immediate connection, but there's a deep training around listening. So it addresses that kind of trauma that's evident under the surface of community life in marginalized communities, but it also, if the community itself sees itself as a healer and not just as a recipient of work, not just as a client base, but when that community holds that power of healing and sees their role as a healing power for power building and for change, that allows us to look at strategies that will be sustainable over the long term. And again, the last one is we're connecting people to each other. We're connecting people to other networks. We're connecting them to our intra-agency partners, our interagency partners, but we're not coming into a community saying, here's a problem, we're going to correct it. But rather, here's a problem, we see these issues. Do you see those issues? And how do we connect to each other and connect to these networks of support that we can make some change happen? How do we work with the county? How do we work with the city? Because when the city comes in, the county comes in, they come in with those nice polo t-shirts, they come in with papers, and they come in with little handouts. That often, it seems, it doesn't really go over very well in the community. But when we have people that are promotoras that are accompanying the city member or the county or other agencies, that allows a deep connection, and people don't feel that they're reduced to being clients or being a focus group. Let's go to the next slide, if that's okay. So again, we just talked about, the community that I'm in. This is kind of, there are 18% of our community in the wealthiest county in California. 18% of the people are living in some degree of poverty. So this is just unfathomable to imagine, but this is just where it's at. 1 in 5 children are born in poverty in Santa Clara County, in Silicon Valley, and yet we have people have 8 people in Silicon Valley have as much wealth as half of the people in Silicon Valley. So this structure, in a sense, I don't want to use the word cements in or seals in opportunity, but it certainly provides a very difficult context for people to exercise self-agency and to exercise a sense of choice and how they want to move forward and address the issues that are coming into their family. So you could see that when people are hemmed in, as it were, by structural realities, there's a kind of a difficulty when people in a very small area, when there's this many people moving this area, the density of the population creates natural tension. I'm going to take a gander that many of the folks that are in the systems that we're trying to address and support live in very similar types of conditions. Let's go to the next slide. I want to talk a little bit about how we kind of got through this and how we kind of addressed some of the youth violence that was happening in the area. We're finding that there is number of knifings, number of gun incidences, number of just kind of violent incidents of youth on youth. It was norteños contra los sureños. It was the two groups fighting each other in a very compacted neighborhood with families and children all in this area. So it was very, very difficult. And we realized we needed to bring the temperature down. So what we did is we worked with already identified community leaders who are kind of respected moral voices. That means we turned to some of the clergy and we turned to some of the leaders in the neighborhood, leaders and that were somewhat associated with the church, because this happened to be a Latino neighborhood. Many of them went to this parish, Our Lady of Guadalupe parish. So we decided probably the strategic thing to do is try to tap into the natural resources in that particular neighborhood, just to see who do we not want to talk to. This neighborhood, many undocumented, did not have a good relationship with the city nor with the county, because at that time there were ICE raids that are going on and ICE agents were embedded in the police department. So there's just a gross mistrust of government workers, a horrible mistrust of anyone coming in to the community that didn't speak Spanish and didn't really understand the community. So what we did is we decided to work with the abuelitas, the abuelas. These are the women that were often the oldest member of the household. They may have been in their 60s or 70s, but these women were in effect the socializing force of holding that family together. There was a high truancy rate. There was a high illiteracy rate, and so the grandmothers, the abuelas, had to speak, and we had them, hey, speak to your grandkids. Talk to them about this. So we were able to talk with the grandmothers, talking about the need for kind of bringing down the temperature in the household, and just basically telling them to tell their kids, knock this shit off, kind of a thing. Knock this off. Just kind of work that way. And what happened is that we had an immediate reduction in instances of violence because we used this particular approach. Let's go to the next slide, if we could do that. So again, just want to just kind of show you all, there are certain strategies that really, really do work. And I have this kind of Venn diagram that kind of shows that you have in the center of all of this, working with a CBO that is of the community. So we had chosen to work with a CBO. In this case was a church, but it could easily have been another agency like the Amigos of Guadalupe. It could have been Somos Mayfair. It could have been the Grail, any number of these smaller CBOs that were located in the neighborhood, made up of not just the clients were going to these places, but they were actually people with lived experience in that neighborhood were on the staff. So we were able to work with these smaller, pretty under-resourced community-based organizations, and that were really interested in what do we do? Well, we need to build resilience, and because we're not going to be able to change this intractable economic political structure that has been in place for over 120 years since the forced migration of Mexican miners from one part of the valley into another part of the valley. This is the story of Santa Clara County, just the forced migration of Spanish-speaking folks and people of color. There are some horrible realities that create these inequities and sustain those inequities. So we realize that the people in those communities are not victims. They're actually quite resilient and they are very united. But the question is, do they have the capacities to connect to the resources? Do they have the capacities to build resources within themselves? And so these are the kinds of dimensions that we have found very helpful in building resilience, in creating a strong sense of united feeling and deeper relationships where neighbors will have each other's back, and also the sense of being have stronger capacity to go to City Hall, to go to the Board of Supervisors, and to initiate conversations with the county on certain resources that are needed to build up in that community. So we've had the Moral Voice, those are the CBOs, including the faith group that's there, a strong provider network, building up a network of people that are going to bring and create pop-up tents and spaces where the people are already gathered. We wanted to, again, develop the promotoras. So leadership development is important. And we created these community markets. And so that's what we're created right now. We're in an adjacent neighborhood, the Santee, Seven Trees neighborhood, where we create a couple of these markets where people can go on any day of the week, at different times. And that really created a strong sense of where we can do public benefits enrollment. They can bring in a healthcare provider was there. We brought in rent support people all in one place, so that people the mothers, las madres, who were carrying the niñitos, and they didn't have a car. They couldn't get to downtown. They couldn't get to the county office. So we brought the county office, we brought downtown resources to that particular neighborhood at least one day a week. And then, of course, we supported that with cultural celebrations. Let's go to the next slide, if that's okay. So again, what's working now? I think I just talked about this. So again, want to underscore this idea that all of these relationship building things is absolutely the core of what we have to do. Because if you don't address the emotional realities of the people, if you don't address the internal disquiet, the sense of frustration and hurt and wounds that are existing because of the system, but also because people don't feel connected. They're not feeling seen and not feeling heard. We need to find ways and strategies that help build those communities. And so again, we need to find ways to address some of those traumas that people are. We're not going to fix those traumas, but we need to address them, and at least that people are seeing. Let's go to the next slide. So a lot of times, here's my little slide about what often happens, what we've been working with in the CBO work that I've been doing, is even with the large agency I'm in right now, is that you have a problem, well, we got a ready-made solution for you. So here it is, and we can train you how to do this, and this will make it happen. So it comes across super neat, and it makes our board members feel really good that we're doing something. But when we kind of have a solution that's generated by inventors that are not located and not in a dialogue and not seated in the presence of the actual community itself, when we don't have that, what happens? It's like, you feel that you're buying a Model T Ford, made on an assembly line. You basically, so the process is, let's find a CBO that's going to do the deliverables that we set. There's going to be a chain of command that we can look at this. We're going to get reports, and then we see the success is based on, we look at the success not on impact, but how are those outcomes performed by the community-based organization. And so there's this kind of a distancing reality and distancing relationship with a CBO. So we could say, yes, we work with CBOs because we do a subcontract with them. But if we don't do but that isn't the same as engaging. So I don't want us to walk away that feel that, because we have worked with a CBO, we've contracted them, that does not the same thing as engaging a community. So let's go to the next slide. So again, this is our saying from Lila Watson, an Aboriginal activist. If you've come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let's work together. It's all about building that relationship. So you have these contexts that people are living in, this very difficult context with structural problems. And you're going to hear a lot of that with Junius. I mean, he's brilliant in all these kinds of things. So he's going to talk about that in his thing. But I'm just simply saying that we have this context that some things are, in a sense, somewhat intractable. We can't change it within a generation unless there's radical revolutionary change. But we have people who are living right now in pain. That's the reality. But you also, in that same reality, you have incredible resilience. You have people that are wise. They know what they need. So the question is, how do you bring that wisdom and that ingenuity that is already there in that community. How do we bring that into dialogue with a resourcing agency? And that's where we do capacity building, not service delivery. How do we build that community so they can walk upstream with us, so that we can walk with them and follow that community going upstream as they ask the question, what the hell is going on? And once they get upstream, they begin to ask that question, what are we going to do? That's the organic solution. It comes from the people themselves, not because we brought that solution to them, but because we engage in a process of building capacity, thinking and capacity building in that community. So it's connecting people to each other and connecting people to other resources that are there within the own community. So this kind of thing, I don't focus on this kind of this long, intractable, crazy diagram, but it's basically saying that when you start to look at the community as an active partner that has a healing role, that has a role of wisdom, that has a role of leadership, that is going to build the solution, that is very unique to that community's needs. These are the amazing things that happen. It's not just one kind of line that you follow through, but it is much richer, and you have a broader community development that is taking place. So again, it's asking ourselves there is healing that needs to take place. Are we the healer, or are we the capacity builder? If we enter into communities, there are people that are natural healers. There are people that do physical healing, spiritual healing, emotional healing, but also they're wise people that understand systems. They may not use the grammar that we use. They may not use the kinds of tools that we would use, but they're still amazing ways to move through it. The question is, will you trust those community members to lead? Will you trust them as co-equal partners? But what really is needed in communities also is having communities join us in a conversation around data. This is always a very difficult, and this is what we struggle with today, is how do you get communities that are not familiar with questionnaires, that are not familiar with baseline setting, that are not familiar with all the structures of moving up the ladder of the self-sufficiency, et cetera, et cetera. How do we deal with that? Well, this is the part where we have to have that conversation with the community. So that's work that is still on the table that really needs to be worked out and done. But when you engage communities in strategic solutions and engage them in the implementation, we have to ultimately engage them in budgeting. And Janice will talk a little bit some of the why that's important, but also looking at why is, we need to have that conversation about what do they see as an indication of progress. Because moving up economically and saying that's the only way to measure progress is not helpful. But when you begin to see within a system that is nearly impossible to escape, as the whole system begins to shift, what are the things that we need to look for? How do we measure that success? That's what I'm saying is still on the table. I wish I had an answer for that, but this is why all of you are here, because y'all are super smart. Let's go to the next one. Next slide. So again, kind of looking at this, I kind of talked it about already. These are things that we need to think about, how, when we engage people as co-active partners, as co-equal partners, what begins to happen is that there's an amazing conversation that we engage in. We ask, are the leaders that we're working with, the promotores, are they really effective? How are we going to measure that effectiveness? Now we're bringing people together in networks. How are those networks being accessed? Are they being used? Are they effective? Are they culturally appropriate? The community meetings, are we just kind of talking at people and doing a raise your hands at the end so that we can kind of check something off on our own measurement tool? Or are we really looking at the impact of having meetings and saying what's happening? How are people engaging? Are we getting more leaders that are engaged in this process to prevent the further wounding, to prevent further trauma from happening? And again, looking at the rate of healing, that's the difficult part, is because, like I said, self-sufficiency matrix depends, it has certain presumptions that, we're going to be jumping from one level of sufficiency to the next level of sufficiency. We know that for our community that we look at this, there are certain barriers that prevent them from happening, like immigration status, deep trauma that is not easily resolved. So how do we measure that healing, and how long does it take, and how do we measure that progress? Let's go to the next slide. So again, here's a checklist that we probably should think about, is choosing your best partner. in the CBO? Are they of the community? Are they in the community? Is this, is that what it is? Are we doing does that community organization have a connecting framework, or is it a corrective framework? Are they just service delivery? Are they turning out more Model T Fords, or are they helping people think through and creating capacity for community leadership? Does that CBO, are they able to actually identify leaders and use leaders and listen to leaders and respect leaders and engage leaders in a real conversation, strategically, design wise and execution wise and evaluation wise? Does that CBO have the capacity to build bridges with other CBOs so that they're not fighting each other, but that in a neighborhood with very few resources, are we choosing the right type of CBO that is open to moving collaboration with their colleagues in other agencies? Are we creating a multi-directional communication structure? Is it up and down, or is it just one way? Does it go outwards to the community? Does it link community members directly to agencies? So we have to kind of say, is there ability for that to happen? And lastly, does that CBO value the data process? They may not have it perfectly, but do they at least value the need to begin to measure that progress? Because we all have to kind of say, at the end of the day, are we making a difference? Let's go to the next slide. So, again, these are just considering yourself as a funder. Are you seeing and treating that community as an equal partner? So this is like your own reflection. Are you comfortable with that partner, and are you flexible enough to take direction? Let's go to the next slide. So if you're not listening to the community, these are the things that are going to happen. If you're not enlisting promotores, this is what's going to happen. If you're not valuing the community, and if you're not knocking and talking on doors, if you're just kind of hanging pamphlets and slipping pamphlets under the door, it's just, don't expect any high turnouts. Let's go to the last slide. I think it should be last slide. So again, I'm just going to leave you with these 5 things. Meet regularly with your CBO. I love to meet with the people that I have in the city, state, and county. I just like to meet with them. I like to hear from what they have to say. I want to keep that focus on the conversation of impact. I really want to kind of keep that focus. And if you are a CBO, or if you're a county person, talk about that focus, about that verifiable data focus. Ask questions, but don't, when you're coming in, if you're a funder, you're coming in, don't come across as a judge and evaluator. Come to ask out of interest, ask out of empowerment. So the tone of voice and how you work with community-based organizations that are often made of people of color, it's not really comfortable when you're kind of coming at them. Leverage, encourage community, build collaborative work, so that when you have a CBO that might get more money than another CBO that wasn't funded by you or by another agency, encourage leveraging support rather than kind of lording over the fact that one agency got money and they didn't, or they're both having to fight each other. Encourage that conversation. And lastly, develop those deliverables together as you put together a contract. So I'm going to stop right there. And I think that I'm not sure who's going to moderate the questions, and if there's even time for questions.
There is one question in the chat now, John, that we could answer, and I think it's a great question. The question is, over how much time, right, did this occur, right? So just looking for some idea of, okay, so what are we looking at here?
So my work as in one project. There was an already made, like at the church project, that basically took 4 months, right? Because there was already established thing. Going into a new neighborhood where we didn't have those kinds of things, it took, not sadly, the reality is it took 1.5 years to build the CBO presence, to really begin to kind of get our feet ready. And it took another 6.5 months to 9 months to really kind of put it in order. So it's not a quick thing, but it's like, it's getting, the question that we always had was getting enough funding to build the capacity within our CBO, the administrative and operational infrastructure for the CBO to get to that place where we can do this kind of impact work. So what we didn't have was we didn't have development funding to get the CBO getting into that place. So that was always a challenge, at least from my side, is that that is going to be really, it's creating capacity in the CBO to do capacity work in the community. So that's what I wish I had way more funding and way more support and more thinking partners to do that. So it was just me and two other people. And what we needed to do is we need to do a lot more outreach. But on the other hand, going slow, we built the alliances. I'm working on another project in a rural town in Santa Clara County, Gilroy, which has very, very difficult challenges, and that's going to take some time. So it is finding the resources and finding a good sugar daddy to pay for your money so that you can get so you can build the infrastructure to do this kind of work. So it takes time.
And you know, I'm hearing, John, in what you're saying, you know, so I'm definitely hearing the old cliche, this is a marathon, not a sprint.
Yes.
And what, could you say a couple words about what it takes to convince funders and folks who make regulations and have deadlines, and to convince them that more time is needed, that this isn't going to be something we can just drop on the community and expect in a year to be able to see verifiable impact?
Well, I think what we need to do is have a more robust conversation around data. I really think that people are looking at data. They're going to make their decisions based on what do you see. So that's a really big thing, because communities are really focused on saving, you know, going out to the river and pulling people out of the river. They need to make that decision to move upstream. We cannot push them upstream. We can't tow them upstream. They have to make that decision. So it takes a long time. We need to find a way, what I call a resiliency metric. We need to start to create the conversation around resiliency, showing how resiliency and trauma care is in fact the place where when you invest in that, you start to see lower levels. And so we need to kind of look at the appropriate data and have a bigger investment in the data that we're looking at. So I think that's something that that I would suggest that needs to happen. And I don't know how, it's way beyond my pay grade to do that. I'm just a CBO kind of a consultant person, I'm community based. So I don't, you know, so that's kind of what I would say to a funder is, you know, what we really need is a real investment in the conversation around resilience. We need a conversation around data build and metrics that are not so impossible. Like the Arizona self-sufficiency metrics is just impossible for people that live in Silicon Valley to conquer that. It just doesn't happen, because there's no way you can work yourself out of poverty when there are no avenues or the structures are just too horrible to move through. So do you throw your hands up? No, you need to say, this is a marathon, but these are the things you need to look at. And this is where the points will show progress.
Great. Thank you, John. And there's somebody put a great term in the chat, a community defined resiliency metric. Yep. Thank you so much, John. We're going to move on to the next part of our presentation. So you've seen a snapshot of what it looks like on the work happening on the ground, the pictures, the narrative. So now we're going to move to a presentation from Junius Williams about the principles and the framework that undergird this work. Junius, please go ahead.
Thank you, Kush. And I want to acknowledge John's work, that citing story, doing some good work there, John. I really appreciate it. In fact, I've got more notes here that I want to talk to you about than doing my presentation. And I am going to do a little bit of that, because I think that there are 2 or 3 things that you mentioned that are really important to highlight. And let me do that before I jump into mine. The first thing is to recognize the name of John's unit, right? It's advocacy and community engagement. Simply doing community engagement without a purpose does not support families and young people. And part of the purpose has to be the advocacy to improve outcomes and conditions. And the fact that that's reflected in the title of the work is noteworthy. The second thing that John mentioned and didn't come back to, but I want to reinforce, and you see it in the language that he uses to describe it, DEIB, That B is fundamentally important. And let me really quickly say something about that. We focused on inclusion, and inclusion is not sufficient, right? This has got to be about belonging. When we include somebody, let me give you a quick example. I'm going to have a party at my house. It's going to be at my house. I'm deciding who gets invited. I'm deciding the music, the mood, the food, everything about that. But I've invited Dennis. I've invited Jennifer to come. You've been included, but I've controlled every aspect of what's going on in that party. That is not sufficient. What we need to do is to move to belonging. And when we move from simply inclusion to belonging, we start having a conversation of how we're going to relate to one another in this newly created environment. We're not coming in and assume that your rules are going to continue to dominate the way that we operate. One of our problems historically is we excluded so many people from fashioning the table that the table's illegitimate. So frequently, when we're pulling people together, we've got to sit down and come to an agreement about what the rules of ownership and ground rules and rules of engagement are going to be. That's belonging. I'm not inviting you to my party. I'm inviting you to a discussion about how we're going to have a party together, and that's belonging. And that's why inclusion is not working. Inviting people of color or women or any group to a table that has been dominated by the value propositions of middle-class white folks is not going to solve it. And this is not to be pejorative around anybody, but the reality of American life is everything is centered on white folks and what they need and their view of the world. And that's why you can't just reinforce that at these tables and expect women or people of color or any excluded population to feel like they've arrived, right? It's not. So that's fundamentally important first part of this. The other thing that John mentioned that's absolutely essential is public agencies have a credibility problem, a low level of trust among the communities, and you can and should be trying to build positive relationships, but the best and most efficient way to that is to identify and support trusted partners in the community who can vouch for you, can have the community give you at least the benefit of a doubt enough to come in and say, I'm going to behave differently. My agency is going to behave differently. Give me an opportunity to show you that we can be different. So that's really important, this notion of trusted partners. I see agencies trying to wade into this, and people are sitting in there saying, those are the MFs who took money or took my kid or did this or that. So you go in with a credibility deficit, and a lot of times people in agencies and people in power and privilege think that, oh, they should all come to me. No, right? So an important part of this is assuming a little humility, recognizing the context of the relationship with these families and these folks, and to say, I gotta come with some humility and I gotta build the confidence that I'm gonna do things differently with folks. One of the other things I want to mention, and I know this is hard, is you as agency folks and public agencies understanding the extent of the limits of what you can do with respect to something. It is noteworthy that where is John housed? John isn't housed in a public agency. John is housed at Catholic Charities. And the reason for that is I have yet to find an agency that's going to empower marginalized people to wrest control and power from them. That doesn't happen. Quick story, back in the 90s when community building was all the rage all over the country, we wrote a grant, got a bunch of money, and recruited from around the city of Oakland some community builders. We trained them in organizing and advocacy, and one of their first major actions was to go to a city council meeting and advocate. They kicked city council's ass 7 ways from Sunday. The next morning, we got a call from city council saying, we funded that ass kicking we got last night. No, you're not gonna do this. They disbanded. Well, they didn't disband, they totally repurposed what those, no more advocacy, no more organizing, no more Point is, people in power are not going to fund their own overthrow. So recognize that that's not what you're doing in community engagement. You're trying to do some foundational things to improve it, but I've yet to see a situation where government has funded and supported its own overthrow in terms of redistribution of power with community folks. I'm sorry, let me get to what I'm supposed to be doing. One other quick note before I go. Kush, I appreciate your upstream and downstream. The only thing I would say is that you gave people and the system a benefit of the doubt. People aren't falling in, people are being pushed in. And we need to understand that. We've got all this flowery language to talk about marginalization. What happened is discrimination, oppression, injury, and harm, and it's a pattern of the history of this country. And it is not surprising that we have so much difficulty in reaching out and engaging all of these populations that we've historically discriminated. Pain, injury, suffering, they know how we've behaved, and if past is pretext to the future, they know what to expect from us. So that's the context. All of that is not to blame all of y'all, but to recognize that you got a steep hill to climb up when you talk about reaching out as public agencies, especially those who have had the power to remove kids from families or to do other deleterious things. You got to build credibility. You got to build relations of trust. And the best way to do that, as John is saying, is don't jump in the water yourself. Get a lifesaver, which is a CBO with credibility, and listen to them. Don't just engage them in a contract. Listen to their experience and expertise to guide you. Sorry, let me go on with what I'm supposed to be doing. Quick slide here. This is an overview. We're going to do a quick Menti poll. I'm going to talk about the context in which this work on community engagement is happening, because it's really important to understand that. I'm going to introduce you to two tools that should help you navigate some of what needs to happen when you're trying to do prevention planning. I'm going to talk about the need for you to decide exactly what you're trying to accomplish. I go into far too many situations where people don't have a goal and an outcome. They just know they got to do something around this messy community engagement stuff, and it actually leads to more problems. I want to share with you some situation analysis questions, a little template that a client asked me to do of just give me a list of some things that I need to be doing so I can get started. And then we're going to do a breakout session to give you some time to talk about the tools and the models. Next slide. Really quickly, identify some challenges and opportunities. We want to understand context. As John said, so much of this is contextual. And if you're from a group that is not part of the marginalized group, there's a context in which these problems are happening that even people who have intimate knowledge and understanding, because you worked in agencies in this, sometimes don't have the perspective and the understanding of the context that's absolutely essential to understand where the people you're dealing with are coming from, right? And what potential solutions are. I'm gonna introduce you to spectrum of community engagement, if you haven't seen it, as a way of situating what it is that you're attempting to do. A toolkit that one of my colleagues did, and then some resources. Next slide. Alrighty. We're going to do two quick Menti polls. If you've got your camera or otherwise, if you look into the chat, we're going to mount a link that you can go to Menti if you don't have a camera and access. But there are two questions on the Menti we want you to do. What are the greatest challenges you're encountering in pursuing community engagement will be the first poll. And then in the second poll, what are the greatest opportunities that you see in terms of pursuing community engagement? So with that, why don't you go ahead and do the poll? And we're only going to do this quickly, a few minutes, so that we can see the results. You're familiar with Menti, where the level of the word shows the degree to which people identified that word. So why don't we go ahead and have you click on and do the poll quickly, and we'll take a look at what you think are some of the challenges and opportunities. Right now we got a lot. Okay, getting a little movement here. Greatest challenges: paternalism, trauma, finding the right time is mistrust are getting centered there. Mistrust, time, the right people, time, time and mistrust. Good. Still moving a little bit. Good. Okay, let's stop there. Trauma, mistrust, time, we're in the center. Let's look at what are the greatest opportunities and take a couple minutes and load some words down that reflect the greatest opportunities. Okay. New ideas and partnership are in the center right now. Growing. New ideas, partnerships, better outcomes has appeared, right? Perspective, need, justice is now there. Justice, new ideas, partnership. Okay. Sustainability and perspective have arrived too. Okay. Alrighty. We'll print those out and make them available to you. If we go to the slide deck, what I'd like to do is the first thing, next slide, please. So I wanted to share this document, this slide, because there is an all-county letter from last year that relates to prevention planning, and it highlighted several things that I think are really important. The need to engage tribes and to recognize their sovereignty and to work with them to plan. Secondly, consulting individuals and families with lived experience or expertise. Third, prioritizing those who are disproportionately impacted by the child welfare system. I would add to that, that's really about centering on those who have had the worst outcomes. Talking about disproportionality without putting a valence, some people are positively disproportionately impacted. White kids are. They are referred and cited at a much lower frequency than their presence in the population. And then the final thing, this is an editorial note. If I go to another public agency and I see them documenting barriers without joining that documenting and dismantling barriers. I'm working in Oregon right now. They've got a whole statewide infrastructure that's around barrier submission, literally. People all over the state submitting what barriers are. We know what the barriers are. What is needed is to dismantle barriers. So whenever I see language like that without a valence that you got to dismantle barriers, documenting them, how many times we're going to document the same stuff? Parents and families have told us that time immemorial. Long-term workers have told us that. We've ignored it. Let's get around to dismantling barriers and not simply documenting. That's wasted time and effort. Next slide, I'm sorry. But those are good things to start with. Where I want to do, the first thing is to talk about contextualizing the work. And you've already started this journey, but there are three things that are happening in terms of community change that you need to understand and integrate. One that you started in a prior series, equity. We've got to address equity, which is what kind of outcomes and disparities are we producing for different people, and how do we address the systematic discrimination and oppression that produce those? You got to deal with equity. You've got to deal with remedying the effects of past discrimination. That is central to solving most problems in America. In fact, there are some problems that if you don't apply an equity standard to and target, we're never going to solve the problem. Grade level reading in Oakland is such a case. Given the population demographics in the city of Oakland, it's a plurality of Latinos, followed by Southeast Asians and Black kids, and finally white kids. There's no way we're going to get to 80% grade level reading unless we deal with the issues that Latino kids are having, both language-related issues of being non-English speakers, poor instruction, inclusion, all, but it's very specific to them. The same with Black kids. But the overall thing is you can't get to 80% reading proficiency if you don't deal with the inequities and the disparities that various groups have. That's one. Equity is in the center. We've got to get equity right. Secondly, we've got to deal with collaboration. And collaboration in 21st century America is a reflection that our social problems are so complex that no single organization or agency, regardless of their power, can solve them alone. It demands collaboration across public and private sectors of the economy, CBOs, families, everybody. You cannot correct these problems by a single organizational solution. So collaboration is being mandated. And finally, you can't do good collaboration without community engagement, because no matter how smart you are as an agency bureaucrat, as an academic, as a policy wonk like me, you don't understand the problem unless you've touched that elephant from all perspectives, including those with lived experience of how those systems are impacting. So all three of these things are absolutely essential, and they're all part of this triumvirate of what we need to put in place to really solve problems and improve outcomes for kids and families. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go through these slides except to say there are compelling reasons that we should center equity in the work. I give you the definition that some colleagues and we published an article in December, the 10-year anniversary of Collective Impact, that is basically a call for centering equity in all of the work. And what we concluded, 6 of us who've worked in this, including the original authors and others who worked in it, is one of the things that we see all over. The reason people are not producing community change is they're failing to address equity. There is hardly a single issue in contemporary America that doesn't have its roots in problems of inequity. So if we're blind to inequity and we're trying to solve problems, we're never going to get there. Equity and inequity is an indispensable part of the problems we've produced in America, and you've got to attack and address equity if you're going to be successful in producing outcomes. Next slide. Similarly, these are 5 of the reasons that we cite in our work of why you have to engage the community and those with lived experience. All of this stuff, you get better results. And if we're really about outcomes and results, we should be looking all over the planet for things that suggest or correlate with better outcomes. And community engagement and experience is it. And there's one compelling reason that I want to highlight. All of us are going to leave these neighborhoods and the communities ultimately when this project, this job, this initiative, whatever, is over. Whether or not the change is sustainable depends on the extent to which it reflects the ideals, the ideas, the analysis of the community. If it's good, they'll sustain it. If it's not, they're going to let it go when you leave. So if you don't have them at the table, you don't have the endorsement of the community, it doesn't reflect their lived experience and their reality. As soon as you leave and that money leaves with you, unfortunately, that strategy is going to leave. It's indispensable to sustainability and the longevity of what we're doing for the community to say, yeah, that's right, we own that and we'll push that. That's part of John's talk about resiliency, the extent to which people feel agency and ownership and come into the meeting and say, we're going to do this or that, regardless of what sponsors are going to say. Next slide, please. Finally, and I'm not going to go through these, you can look at the literature. There are benefits in terms of employing collaborative techniques. There's a list. Increased resources come when you're collaborating, improved problem solving, better communication, better community engagement, not necessarily residents and people with lived experience, but across sector, increased innovation and improved impacts and outcomes. The evidence is there. It's a better way of doing business, and we need to move toward pulling these things together and really leveraging them for outcomes. Next slide. All right. 2 tools I want to show you really quickly, and you've got resources on these on the list to go much deeper. There are 2 things. One is called the spectrum of, it's actually community participation because it comes out of the International Association of Participation. Many of us have renamed it to focus on engagement rather than public participation. 2 tools, this spectrum of community engagement, and then a community engagement toolkit. Next slide. All right. Next slide. These are just links to go to various. So here's a basic tool, and I'm going to go really quickly through this. What the IAP has done in this model is say that there are levels of engagement that go all the way from ignoring community participation all the way over to this level of community ownership, right? And look at that. You can just ignore the community altogether, or you can inform them, which is basically placating them. You can consult them, but that's kind of token. When I'm in a consulting relationship and I'm a consultant for a living, people either take or reject my advice. There's nothing obligatory about that. But you can involve folks where you're really trying to surface the voices and the sentiment and the understanding of the problem of people who are nearest to it. You can really collaborate where everybody's delegating part of the power into the collective, or the ultimate stage is you can actually defer to community ownership. I know one example of that in all the time I've been working. That is the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. If you don't know about it, look it up. It's one of the few times that government is actually given to community ownership. What they gave them is what the Economic Development Agency usually has authority for. The city of Boston gave it to a neighborhood organization, and the neighborhood controlled it. That's the only example I've ever seen of that actually happen. But really quickly, so you've got these levels of engagement from ignoring to informing to consulting to involving. And then what is also along the left axis is really important to understand. And they've labeled these in a way that's compelling. What's your stance toward community? Are you ignoring, informing, consulting? What's the impact of that in terms of what it's likely to produce with the community? What are the community engagement goals of these various levels of engagement? What's the message that you're sending to the community when you engage in that? What are the typical activities? If I'm really trying to inform the community, what am I doing? Fact sheets, open houses, presentations, billboards, one-way communication, right? Then finally, and one of the most important one is resource allocation. Look down at that bottom row and the ratio of it. So you see what this framework is. The reason it's as important, and let me say this quickly, is that we tend to talk to communities over in collaboration and defer to them, and we tend to behave over on the left side of ignoring and informing. And what that leads is to further exacerbate what are sometimes already bad relationships between the community. You're promising all of this stuff to the community that you're going to really have decision-making control, all that stuff over there, but you're behaving to give them nothing, right? That's the problem that many public agencies have. And while I would prefer you be over on the right side, I'm more interested in you communicating and behaving consistent with your goals and objectives. And if you've taken a position, we're simply going to inform people, then behave consistently. Don't go and tell them this is really the dream of ownership and control and all that when you got no intent whatsoever to go in that direction. I see more of a problem with that. Communities understand power. They've been on the other end of the power dynamics for most of their lives. They understand and can accept the absence of power in their hands. We exacerbate that when we lie to them about what our intents, and we promise them an opportunity to really partner and own stuff together, and we never intend. This is a great framework. And what I do with clients is, where are you right now? And are you behaving consistently with that? Where do you want to go? And let's start implementing some behaviors that are consistent with there. But just be honest. If you're in an organization to say, hey, my board ain't never going to get to collaboration and defer, then operate consistent with what is likely to be situation. So that's the spectrum of community engagement, a great tool. And I start with most of my clients when I'm working on community engagement. Let's situate where you are now and where you want to go so that we can have a coherent conversation about how to get you there, or not waste effort. If you've got no intent to move from where you are, then don't waste a lot of the community's time and effort, or staff time and effort, and your credibility. Next slide. This is another variation of the same one where they promised to the public and the public participation goal, a little cleaner model. I share it with you because one of the things about all of this work is, don't look at anybody's model and say, I got to follow that, right? You got a level of expertise that no model developer typically has. So I really encourage my clients, you look at a tool like this, a model, adapt it to something that makes sense. I don't want a 7x6 table with an organizing meeting. I want something clean and sleek like this that focuses on what I want. Third, next slide. Here's a third variation that my colleague Paul Schmidt did in the toolkit. I'm going to show you another variation. 2 points. The most important point. Take any of these tools and vary them to make sense to where you're working and whom you're working with. And it's not just translation in terms of other languages. It might be breaking it down in different ways. Next slide. So that's the next slide. One of the first things, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but you'll find this in the toolkit, and this slide and the next slide, an exercise for your agency or organization or collaborative to do, to figure out and have a discussion about where you are and where you want to move. I'm not going to go through all this, but you can see there's a tool here that has some probe questions for you to use in the toolkit. Next slide, please. The other thing in the toolkit, and somehow the slide with the 13 elements of the toolkit is missing. But let me say this, one of the important things and places to get started, next slide, please, is to look at your current work. Your current work is going to give you great insights into your value system that's been operating with you locally. And here's a tool that my colleague, and you've got the link to this, Paul Schmidt has in the community engagement toolkit. But what he has is, you need to assess who's at the table. And he has designed this one, and it's got 4 dimensions. What's the experience of the people at the table in terms of experience with the issue? What's their demographic relevance? So for John, working in a largely Latino community, you're sort of looking at what's the relevance of people's ethnic racial experience for it. There's also, and this is an important point, in addition to demographic relevance, we have tended to associate demographic discrimination with geographic discrimination, right? So there's usually a geographic dimension, right? To John's neighborhood that he's working in, East Oakland here, Fruitvale neighborhood here, the coincidence of geographic discrimination and demographic discrimination bind together well in America. So this is something that lets you sit down and let's take a look at who's at our tables now, because it's going to give us insight to where we've done well in terms of representation and where we haven't, and to have a conversation about what are our expectations and goals around who is at the table. Next slide, please. And next slide. I'm going to jump ahead. Next slide, please. One of the things really quickly, and you can go back and look at this slide. I tell people, there's a couple ways you can approach this community engagement for prevention planning. One is to do the minimum requirement that gets you some useful information to improve services for kids and family. And it's okay to do it that way, right? To say the minimum we're going after now is we're not gonna, in contrast to the other option, which is to build a sustainable infrastructure for community engagement, right? So you need to differentiate. If all I can do this year is have a quality experience for gathering input, that's okay, but then contour your behavior to that. If you're really thinking about building an infrastructure, and I strongly recommend, this stuff is not going away. The pressure to do collaboration, community engagement, and equity is going to be a permanent feature of the way that we work. So I recommend to my clients, build the infrastructure. But if you don't want to, at least do a credible job in gathering quality input from kids and families about what the needs are within the system. Next slide. No, this is a slide that I wanted to do, but I'm going to jump through about just positioning yourself. And just one quick note. One of the first places to start is what are the local policy requirements and agency philosophy, right? You may be, oh, we need to go over here to collaboration, but your local policy and agency may be over in informing. So making sure you're looking at what the local landscape is, what your agency and county or whomever is willing to do is an important part of your assessment, because if you're uninformed, then you need to operate in that modality and again, not send mixed messages to the community. Next slide, please. Okay, so next slide. One of the things that I've done with some clients, and I'm gonna go through these really quickly, is to try to work through with them a process of clarifying what it is that they're attempting to do. Because again, a lot of times I go in and I ask them and they can't answer the basic question. So who is being engaged? Who do you need to engage? Why are you attempting to engage them? What are the outcomes intended from the engagement? Who's going to be doing the engagement and who is accountable for the results? So these are some situation analysis sort of questions. Next slide, I probed down in a couple of them. By whom? Here's a real problem. The fact that somebody has an organizational designation to do community outreach and engagement doesn't mean that they're the right person to do it. I see a lot of situations I go into, and because of somebody's positional title, they were assigned this, and quite frankly, they don't give a damn about doing this work. So a big part of this is making sure you get the right people within the public agency who are excited, committed, and willing to do this work, because it means nighttime work. It means stuff that ain't necessarily a part of the bureaucratic culture. And I go into a lot of situations, the first thing I notice, well, they got the wrong people doing the work. This ain't never going anyway. That's one. Next slide. Who's accountable for the results? This is even more of a problem. I go into all these situations, there are no metrics except how many people showed up at a meeting, which ain't metrics at all. I could pay people and get however many people I want at a meeting. We need some qualitative measures of what's happening in that engagement. But the problem is there aren't metrics for accountability, and there are not designation of responsible parties for community engagement. Again, we measure and we evaluate what's important to us. And if we ain't measuring and we ain't evaluating, it probably ain't important to us. So those are some things to do. And I'm gonna, next slide, please. this is, I'm not going to spend time going through this. This is when I was asked by someone, can you give me a list of 10 things to help me navigate this? I can't follow instructions, so there are 11, but there's 11-step process that I designed for a client that I'll share with you. If you needed a blueprint in terms of how to traverse this territory, here's where, what one thing again, Item 3, landscape documentation and analysis. Who on the agency staff, who in the community is doing good community engagement? That's the starting point. I'm going to go there. And whenever I go to work someplace, I start with the public health department. They've got requirements under ACA for community needs assessment and community improvement plan. They're doing all sort of engagement. They usually have capacity within an agency, another county agency, a great place to get started. Not enough time. Let me stop because I want to give you some time to get in. I'm going to skip. You have the challenges, opportunities, and some promising practices. I'm going to skip those for time because I want to give you the instruction and give you some time to get into your small groups and talk about both some things from John's presentation, my own breakout groups. Well, you'll automatically be assigned, next slide, to breakout groups. You're going to have 15 minutes for the breakout discussion. Briefly introduce yourselves and your organization. Ask if somebody will volunteer to lightly facilitate, and then ask somebody to record and report out. You're going to have about 5 minutes for each of the discussion questions, maybe a little more. Make sure that everybody gets a chance to talk. And each person has a copy of the spectrum in the advanced materials that were sent out. So that's what we're going to do. And I'll show you the questions in a moment. Afterwards, we're going to do a debrief. We're not going to do a long debrief. I'm going to ask each small group reporter to give us a headline or two. And a headline is not the whole story, it's the headline. So think in that frame for time. And then we'll open it up for everybody to add their headlines and do some final comments. Next slide, please. Here are your discussion questions, and we'll post them so you'll have these. But what we want to know is, where is your agency on the spectrum of community engagement right now? And where do you want it to be on the spectrum is basically the first question. Where are you and where do you want to be? And if you want your agency to move to the right side, how should you structure the process of information gathering for your prevention plan that'll lay a foundation for it? So I'm asking you two things. Where are you and where do you want to go? And what are the structures and processes that you think might be useful to get you to where you want to go that could be applied to your next round of prevention planning? We're going to give you about 15 minutes. Again, get in and get started. We'll get the questions into the thing, and you'll get a 5-minute and a 1-minute warning. And then we'll reassemble on the other side and talk a little bit about what came up in your meetings. Welcome back, everyone. What we're going to do is, because of time, want to do one thing. We want to get a quick report out from each of the groups with headlines, and I'll explain that in a moment. And then we'll have some time for John and I to answer any questions before the closeout. And what we want you to do, and think about this, could the reporter from each group give us a headline or two from the group? For example, a headline about where people are on the spectrum, or a headline of where people want to go on the spectrum, or a headline regarding the route that y'all talked about to get there, whatever's there. Again, the reporter, could you give us a couple? And then after all of the groups report in, we'll open it up and get some final ones, popcorn style, from anybody. So group one, could the reporter for group one give us a couple of your headlines? Do you know which group you were in?
Would any
Troy.
recorder like to get started?
Yeah, anybody
Troy.
who goes. I'm sorry.
Troy Nichols was ours.
Okay, Troy, go ahead.
Thanks, Elizabeth, because I voluntold myself, but definitely thank you. Thank you, Junius and John, for all that you've presented to us. A lot of reinforcing stuff, but a lot of work we have to do. So our group, really quickly, our headline was sustainability. We talked a little bit about the whole process and the chart and things like that, but how do we sustain this? Sustainability to evaluation, right? What do we need? Some of the things you talked about, Junius, and John, you alluded to this, is having champions and having folks within the community that we collaborate with, because sometimes us coming in, we're seen as certain things. Another thing that came up is, just like we do land acknowledgements, we've got to do system failure acknowledgements, right? Acknowledge that there are things that we haven't done right. And that will lead us to better feedback loops, because one of the things that happens oftentimes is that we collect information, we do a lot of work, and then those folks don't hear from us again. This is a 5-year plan. We want feet under the table. So we want a feedback loop that folks know what's going on, even if we don't achieve what we say we're going to achieve, to have conversations about how we repair that. So a lot of talk about trust, trauma-informed work, and various things like that, but both sustainability and authentic relationship building is what rose to the top.
Alrighty, very good, Troy. Thank you for that. Next group, and good modeling too, Troy. Next person, somebody else want to jump in and share some headlines from their group with us? Anyone?
I don't mind, but our group was a little interesting in that there was a lot of a wide range of roles, and not a lot of direct roles in the community, in the county engagement process of community collaboration. But for those who were there, I think maybe one of the headlines we had was, it's complicated. Depending on your role, on your agency, on your role in the collaboration process. And for we had someone from a CAPC agency who gave some really beautiful examples of being on the far right of the engagement process, of utilizing parent advisory boards to inform their work. And feeling really positive about their level of community engagement. And then we had someone from another county who felt more on the talking specifically to tribal engagement, feeling a little bit more on the left side of the spectrum, and hoping and desiring to move further to the right. But again, talking about how it's a very complicated process.
Okay, thank you much, Monica. Next, somebody else want to report out a couple of headlines from their group for us?
I can go. I felt like our headline was intentionality, and I felt like our group talked a lot about some of the strengths that they already have in being on the right-hand side of that chart, and just some of the specific things that they felt like they were doing well, and really coming at it with strength. And let me think if there's anything really specific. They talked a lot about incorporating people with lived experiences, and how some of their agencies even hired their clients, and those became the people that were in leadership. So I thought that was really powerful.
Yeah, that's good. Nice example too, Pamela. Next, somebody else want to jump in and share with us a couple of headlines?
I'll share from group 4. So we had a couple of community-based agencies, someone from probation and child welfare. So I heard the theme is they're, mostly in the middle of the spectrum, but there's intent to move forward more to the right. Everyone pretty much said they think they're doing good, looking to do better. I heard some good, action steps, including rebranding, the perception of the agency, restructuring, hiring of people with lived experience, meeting the family and the community where they are, and connecting to like a program or a project. For instance, with probation, looking at youth education, improving that can kind of expand that. So kind of linking on to one project to kind of build that trust and that rebranding, and having events and starting there to kind of work on moving towards, true shared power and collaboration.
Good, thank you, Elizabeth. Anyone else want to share their group's headlines with us?
I can share for my group. I don't know what number we were. We were a small group of 3, and I can say that few headlines. This is difficult work. There's sort of a wide spectrum of possibilities, and that really oftentimes depends on the resources and size of your county. The challenges for rural counties are very different than for medium or large counties. That some counties are doing this really well and really trying to move more towards the right of that of the chart you presented with us, Junius. And then an idea came up about co-leading, having the CPP effort and meetings co-led by someone with lived expertise. So those were the highlights. Team, feel free to include anything I might have missed.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Next group, any other groups that haven't reported that would like to report anything out?
I can go. Hi, I'm Alicia. I'm from Group 2. We had representatives from Tulare, San Francisco, Contra Costa, and the YMCA. Our headline was primarily around establishing a greater level of comfort for information sharing in order to facilitate community connections. The bulk of us are kind of hovering between on the spectrum inform and consult, or consult and involve. We've established community connections and are continuing to move forward with engagement and turn to the community, but we're also trying to address barriers so that individuals with lived experience and who are invested in their community actually feel comfortable sharing about how they feel about the prevention work we're talking about. We discussed how individuals are often reluctant to be candid with agencies, especially when we hold the purse strings and perception and the perception that we make all the decisions. And we also acknowledge that workforce capacity is often a barrier in the work that we're doing.
Good, thank you, Alicia. Others, anybody else before we conclude this segment?
I can go really quick. I'm not sure what group we were in, but I would say similar to what some of the other folks were sharing, but most of us were around like the involve and collaborate. We all kind of played different roles. And so it was interesting just to kind of compare and contrast that. But one of the things that did come up a lot was consistency and staying the course and expansion. So like continuing to involve additional voices, making sure that you're representing the diversity of the community that you're serving, be it a large county or the population that you're working with. And then making sure that you continue to meet and don't give up and continue to bring those voices together was kind of the themes of what we talked about.
Good, good. Thank you, Nicole. Anyone else before I turn it back to Kush? With that, Kush, it's back over to you for your direction.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for participating.
And
right.
I don't know how we are time-wise, Kush, but I would agree to do this since I ran over time. If people have questions, I will, if they'll get them to y'all, I will answer them and get the answers written out and back to you. There is one especially intriguing one already in chat that I saw that I think would be helpful for folks. But whatever you got, give to me and I will generate some responses and get them back to you, because I know we're short on time right now.
We do have time. We do have time for some questions.
Okay.
So and there's one. This might be the one you're referring to, Junius. With the restrictive county rules around contracts and procurement, it can be really difficult to build deliverables into a contract together with a CBO without disqualifying a CBO from being eligible. Any good ideas about how to tackle that?
Great question. And we need to stop making the excuse about nonprofit capacity. The lack of capacity in the nonprofit sector is a direct result of the lack of investment of public agencies and foundations. So the first thing you do is you find some good nonprofits with strong credibility in their financials who can be fiscal sponsored. You remove that from them. You secondly, though, not only get money for them to do this sort of work, but you get them some capacity building money. We funded them for failure, and now we're scapegoating them for not having the capacity. You can't have both ways. Either you invest and let them build the capacity, or you stop interposing that. So I would found a foundation and a good nonprofit and say, you put some money in a pot or you do it yourself, right? I prefer nonprofits because they got flexibility to do stuff. When I ran one, not to sound arrogant, but I was a king, right? If I wanted to change a policy because somebody needed a check tomorrow, I could change it. You want that fluidity in the partner to deal with the exigencies that families who are marginalized are going to bring. They're looking at that check for that stipend today. They don't want it 2 weeks. So anyway, that's what I would do. The solution there, but we should stop saying the community lacks capacity and we should invest in building the capacity of these very organizations. Black, brown, and Native organizations have been funded for failure. And now we're claiming the failure and we're going to go to white organizations. Unacceptable. Invest and build their capacity to serve their communities.
Thank you, Junius. Other questions? Other questions? Oh, you know, Junius, your answer reminded me of a program in Los Angeles here called the Watts Leadership Institute, and it is funded by the Annenberg Foundation. And all the Leadership Institute has become the fiscal sponsor and channels whatever is needed. We need more diapers. Fine. The Watts Leadership Institute can write that CBO a check. And sometimes that CBO is like a mom, 3 moms starting out to start to make sure that everybody has diapers or PPE during the pandemic or whatever that was. So I just really appreciate you elevating that model. And I just want to echo that it does work. And there are examples all over of that structure.
I'm having trouble hearing.
Oh, apparently Alexa is having trouble hearing me. I apologize, folks. All right, I don't see any other questions in the chat. Oh, wait, nope. Oh, there's a comment in the chat just connected to what we're saying, which is living wage included in funding. Oftentimes CBO staff are supporting the community, but also in line to ask for services. Yeah. And often we get the marginalized to take care of the marginalized. And no, don't fund all of it. So yeah.
Yeah, nonprofits need to stop taking or placing the burden to support this work on marginalized folks. They really do. All of us should be in the nonprofit sector, and I'm a culprit in this and will admit my failures. I needed to be much more dedicated. Everybody had a sustainable wage, but retirement, benefits plans, other things, the nonprofit sector needs to take care of its people. And encouraging nonprofits to hire residents and other folks, because that's part of an advancement chain. That's part of a career trajectory. And good nonprofits that I know, East Bay Asian Youth Center, almost all of their staff, except the director, lived in the neighborhood and once was a recipient of services. That's how committed they are to elevating the economic status of their folks and paying living wage. Living wage in Oakland right now is $19.95 an hour, 2 people working full time. Nonprofits ain't doing that. We need to do it. We can't make our folks who have already been marginalized and oppressed have to pay for correcting the problems that we've created.
Well, on that note, I'm going to turn it back over to Caltrin, who has graciously and skillfully hosted this session.
Thanks, Krish. We would like to thank Junius and John and Casey Family Programs and Implematics as our partners in this. I think the discussion today was exceptional, and we've certainly thought about how this leaves us all, not with just a lot to think about, but a lot to act on, a lot to put the pieces together and move forward. So we would like to thank you all for joining us today. There is a survey and a certificate in the chat now. Please do take a couple of moments and give us your comments and your suggestions. And we have also dropped the link for the next Learning Series Forum on April 5th, which will talk about implementation of primary prevention. So please join us again then. We look forward to seeing you. Everyone have a great day.